Pleasant day to each and everyone. Our topic for today will all about the cerebellum. So let's have a review on the development of the brain. The brain and the spinal cord develop from the ectodermal neural tube, and the anterior part of the neural tube expands along with the associated neural crest tissue. And constrictions in this expanded tube soon appear. So there will be constrictions, creating three regions called primary brain vesicles. So the constrictions are called your primary brain vesicles, particularly in about 3 to 4 week age of gestation in the embryo. So the three primary brain vesicles are your prosencephalon, mesencephalon, and rhombencephalon. So these are the three primary brain vesicles. Prosencephalon is your forebrain, mesencephalon is your midbrain, and rhombencephalon is your hindbrain. Your prosencephalon later will develop into your telencephalon and diencephalon. Your mesencephalon is still your mesencephalon, and your rhombencephalon will develop into your metencephalon and your myelencephalon. These are your five secondary brain vesicles during the 5 week embryo, and later on with the development, your telencephalon will give rise to your cerebrum and your lateral ventricles. Your diencephalon will make up your thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus, and your third ventricle. Your mesencephalon will develop into your midbrain and aqueduct of the midbrain. Your metencephalon will develop into your pons and cerebellum and the upper part of the fourth ventricle, and your myelencephalon will develop into your medulla oblongata and the lower part of the fourth ventricle. So here are the cavities wherein the cerebrospinal fluid will be present in our brain. So take note, our topic is all about the cerebellum, and it's developed from the metencephalon and rhombencephalon. And the cerebellum later on, we'll learn that it's closely associated to your pons and the medulla, and even to your fourth ventricle. So what are different major parts of the brain? We include the brainstem, this one. It's continuous with the spinal cord. The brainstem includes your medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. Okay, brainstem. And you have your diencephalon. The superior to the brainstem includes your thalamus, hypothalamus, and the pineal gland. The pineal gland is part of your epithalamus. Your cerebrum or cerebrum is the largest part and most superior of the brain. The surface covered with gray matter, your cortex, outer part, and the deep to cortex is the cerebral white matter. The cerebellum is the posterior and inferior part of the brain, which means little brain. It looks like a little brain. And of course, we all know that the brain and the spinal cord is covered with protective layers of meninges. From outer to inner, we have the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. Okay, your cerebellum is the second only to the cerebrum in size. Okay, let's get oriented with the picture. This is a sagittal section, a medial view. This is the this cerebrum, cerebral cortex. This is your cerebellum. Okay, cerebellum is different from cerebrum. Your cerebellum occupies the inferior and posterior part of the cranial cavity and has a highly folded surface that is greatly greatly increases the surface area of its outer gray matter cortex. So remember, the outer cortex is made up of gray matter. So it allows for a greater number of neurons to be present in this folding surfaces. So the cerebellum is just about 1/10 of the brain mass, and yet it contains nearly half of the neurons in the brain. So it is posterior to the medulla and the pons, and inferior to the posterior portion of the cerebrum. Okay, so this is your pons and the medulla. So posterior to it, you will be able to find the cerebellum, and inferior to the posterior portion of the cerebrum. Anterior, posterior, inferior part of the cerebrum will be your cerebellum. So the transverse fissure, this one, is a deep groove, and along with the tentorium cerebelli, which supports the posterior part of the cerebrum, separates the cerebellum from the cerebrum. This is your cerebrum. This is your cerebellum. Okay, so separating the cerebellum to your cerebrum would be your transverse fissure along with your tentorium cerebelli. In the superior or inferior views, the shape of the cerebellum resembles a butterfly. This is a superior view. This is an inferior view. So this would be the body of the butterfly, and this would be the wings, body, wings. The central constricted area is the vermis. This is your vermis. It means worm. And the lateral wings or lobes are your cerebellar hemisphere. So you have a cerebellar hemisphere here and one also on the other side. So it somehow looks like a butterfly. So each hemisphere consists of lobes separated by deep and distinct fissures. The anterior lobe and posterior lobe govern subconscious aspects of skeletal muscle movements. So they have a contribution to how we move, okay, with the skeletal muscles. And later on, we will know that the cerebellum uh, greatly has an impact with fine movements and balance. The flocculonodular lobe means like a wool-like tuft on the inferior surface contributes to the equilibrium and balance. Okay, so let's look for the flocculonodular node. So here, okay, more or less locate can be appreciated more on the inferior view. So we have the anterior lobe and posterior lobe here, and we have the flocculonodular lobe here. Just another view, anterior, posterior, and you have your flocculonodular lobe here, separated by your posterolateral fissure and primary fissure from the posterior lobe, anterior, and flocculonodular lobe from the posterior lobe. The superficial layer of the cerebellum or the cerebellar cortex. So once you hear cortex, more or less, when we discuss about the different parts of the body, cortex means the outer layer. Okay, so the superficial layer of the cerebellum or the cerebellar cortex consists of gray matter in a series of slender parallel folds called your folia, or we could pertain it to the leaves. Okay, so let's get oriented. This is your cerebellum. Outer cortex or outer layer is composed of what? Gray matter. And they are composed of your parallel folds called your folia. So we could see here the folds, and these are your folia. Gray matter outer. Deep to the gray matter are tracts of white matter called your arbor vitae. Okay, which means tree of life that resemble branches of a tree. Okay, so inside, deep to your outer cortex would be your arbor vitae, made up of what? White matter. Okay, gray matter outside, white matter inside. So you could see or appreciate here that it looks like branches of the tree, and your folia would be your leaves. Okay, so it looks like a tree. Even deeper within the white matter are your cerebellar nuclei, regions of gray matter that gives rise to axons carrying impulses from the cerebellum to outer brain centers. So we would learn later that the cerebellum will have connections to different structures in the brain. So we'll now proceed with the cerebellar peduncles. Three groups of numerous efferent and afferent fibers that links the cerebellum to the outer or other parts of the central nervous system. We have three: superior, middle, and inferior cerebellar peduncles. Your superior cerebellar peduncle connects your cerebellum to the midbrain, middle cerebellum to the pons, and inferior cerebellar peduncle cerebellum to the medulla oblongata. Here in the picture, we'll appreciate the color codings. Superior having connections to the midbrain, middle having connection from cerebellum to your pons, and the inferior cerebellar peduncle have connections to your medulla oblongata, which these three, midbrain, pons, medulla, are parts of your brainstem. So the three paired cerebellar peduncles attach the cerebellum to the brainstem, and these bundles of white matter consist of axons that conduct impulses between the cerebellum and other parts of the brain. So the superior cerebellar peduncles contain axons that extend from the cerebellum to the red nuclei of the midbrain and to several nuclei of the thalamus. Okay, red nuclei of the cerebellum. The middle cerebellar peduncles are the largest peduncles that their axons carry impulses from voluntary movements from the pontine nuclei, which receive input from motor areas of the cerebellar cortex into the cerebellum. So here we could see the superior and middle peduncles. Okay, superior, midbrain, red nuclei. Middle, pontine nuclei, receiving input from motor areas of the cerebral cortex. How about the inferior cerebellar peduncle? Consists of axons of the spinocerebellar tracts that carry sensory information into the cerebellum from proprioceptors in the trunk and limbs. 2. Axons from the vestibular apparatus of the inner ear and from the vestibular nuclei of the medulla and pons that carry sensory information into the cerebellum from proprioceptors in the head. So when we say proprioception, these pertain to knowing the position of the body, whether what's the direction of our head. So this helps us in the coordination part of the body. And when we talk about vestibular apparatus of the inner ear, this pertains to the not only proprioception, but also to balance and equilibrium. Third is the axons from the inferior olivary nucleus of the medulla that enter the cerebellum and regulate the activity of the cerebellar neurons. Fourth, axons that extend from the cerebellum to the vestibular nuclei of the medulla and pons. So this is now from the cerebellum to the vestibular nuclei. Number two is vestibular apparatus, and from the vestibular nuclei to the cerebellum. Number five, axons that extend from the cerebellum to the reticular formation. So all of this, no, from inferior cerebellar peduncles, not only does it pertain of from the medulla, but also part of the pons. Just another picture that will, so that we could appreciate the different peduncles, the superior, the middle, and inferior peduncles. The flocculonodular lobe consists of the nodulus and a flocculus. That's why it's called your flocculonodular lobe. The vermis, the worm part of your butterfly. And you have your different hemispheres over here. There are three layers of the cerebellar cortex. We have one, molecular layer, two, the Purkinje cell layer, and three, the granular layer. The molecular layer contains two types of neurons. What are the two types of neurons? Stellate cells, which are located at an outer portion of the molecular layer, and an inner basket cell, basket cells, outer stellate, inner basket. So here, this is the cerebellar cortex, just picture that will help us remember the different structures that make up the cerebellar cortex. Remember, cortex, outer part, made up of gray matter. So these are the three layers. Granular, inner, Purkinje cell layer would be your intermediate layer, and you have an outer or superficial layer, the molecular layer. We talked about the molecular layer contains two types of neurons, outer stellate cells, inner basket cells. So molecular layer, we could see outer stellate cells and inner basket cells. The Purkinje cell layer is composed of different Purkinje cells and large Golgi type 1 neurons, and flash-shaped and are arranged in a single layer. Okay, so you have here your Purkinje cells, okay, arranged in a single layer. Granular layer is your innermost layer that is close to your white matter. Okay, the white matter is located inside. And your granular layer is packed with small cells, or we could also call it your granule cells, with densely staining nuclei and scanty cytoplasm. So we could see here the different granule cells of the granular layer. Okay, and we could appreciate here mossy fibers and climbing fibers that give connections to the cerebellar cortex to spread the impulse that is needed for the spread of the information. Okay, so we could also Appreciate here the parallel fibers from the granule cells, okay? Because they are positioned, or you could appreciate it parallel to other fibers in the cerebellum. We could see here Golgi cells at the Purkinje cell layer. So this one is divided into the cell layer, afferent system, interneurons, and an efferent system of the cerebellum. What are the functions of your cerebellum? And what knowing these functions, and when we talk about abnormalities seen in a particular patient, then we will know, we could correlate it that there could be a problem with the cerebellum if these functions are not present or are abnormal in a particular patient. So the primary function of the cerebellum is to evaluate how well movements initiated by the motor areas in the cerebrum are actually being carried out. So the movements in our body are initiated by the motor areas in the cerebrum. And the function of your cerebellum is to evaluate if these initiated movements are actually being carried out. No? Are the plans carried out? So when movements initiated by the cerebellar motor areas are not being carried out correctly, the cerebellum detects the discrepancies. The cerebellum will know that the movement of the hand or the finger is not the movement that the motor area in the cerebrum planned, was the planned thing to do. Okay, so the cerebellum, when when it detects discrepancies or problems, it will send feedback signals to the motor areas back to the cerebral cortex via its connections to the thalamus. So it will send signals that, hey, there are discrepancies, there are abnormalities that I sense that are not coordinated with the body movement. So the feedback signals help correct the errors, smooth the movements. It makes the movements fine and coordinated, and coordinate complex sequences of skeletal muscle contractions. So all of this help in the movement and balance of the body. So what are skeletal muscle contractions that are complex? So movement like running, just simply by walking, even and certain balances in the body. So aside from this coordination of skilled movements, the cerebellum is the main brain region that regulates posture and balance. Okay? Posture and balance. You cannot do this when your cerebellum is not functioning well. Okay? So if there is a problem with the cerebellum, let's say due to a trauma of the back part of the head, maybe from a vehicular accident because uh, due to a fall, okay? These aspects of cerebellar function make possible all skilled muscular activities like balance or in gymnastics. What else? What other bodily activities that you could think that the cerebellum is needed? Like maybe some of you want to be a surgeon someday, and a surgeon really needs fine skills in movement, especially in suturing and handling instruments in the operating room, or playing volleyball or other sports. No? So The cerebellum really needs to function at its best so that what you think could be actually be done by the body. Dancing also, uh, in dancing, the cerebellum is needed, and also in singing. You might think that in singing, there's no really movement, but in singing, we also use muscles for the movement of the face, the mouth, the facial expression, and even the making up of the voice. So the presence of reciprocal connections between the cerebellum and association areas of the cerebral cortex suggests that the cerebellum may also have a non-motor function, such as cognition, acquisition of knowledge. No? So cognition is not just acquisition of knowledge, but knowing what you're doing. Cognition, knowing or being oriented with the time, place, and even oriented with the people that you're talking to. And it has been found out that the cerebellum might have also connections or uh, function with language processing. So this view, the cognition and language processing, is supported by imaging studies using your MRI and your PET scans, magnetic resonance imaging, and your positron emission topography scans. Then studies also suggest that the cerebellum may play a role in the process of sensory information. Thank you. So uh, the cerebellum is really important in the fine movements, balance, and equilibrium. And in a patient with that we're entertaining, that the cerebellum is not functioning well, we do tests. We let the patient follow some fine movements like rapid alternating movements, like we do this one, rapid alternating movement of the palm of the hand. Okay, the patient cannot do this one. There is no coordination of doing this one when the cerebellum is not functioning well. Speech might also be affected because, as what we have learned, speech and talking uses muscles, and it's a motor function. Okay, so language processing is also affected, speech. Okay, what else? Balance is also affected when the cerebellum is not functioning well. And when the patient is not able to do this, the patient might have what we call dysdiadochokinesia. Okay, and then the patient cannot also follow instructions like pointing and touching the nose, and then uh, touching the nose and touching the finger of the patient, the finger of the doctor. Okay, there won't be coordination, and the patient will miss pointing. Okay, because there you want the patient wants to touch and follow the instruction of touching his nose and then touching the finger of the doctor. Okay, while moving, the patient wants to follow the instruction, but the patient cannot do it because there is no coordination. Okay, and then even touching the heel of the patient, touching and sliding it to the shin or the knee. Okay, the patient cannot also do that. So I hope you learned something with this lecture and appreciate the function of the cerebellum and where is it located. And this is important once you reach the second year and learn how we test for the problems in the cerebellum. Thank you for your attention and have a pleasant day.